pleasant day to everyone. I am Joseph Nathaniel Alhambra and I am going to discuss the definition of communication as well as the types of communication according to mode, context, purpose, and style. Before we dive deeper to the discussion, let us first define what does communication means. To make it simple, communication is the process of exchanging information through verbal and non-verbal means. The word communicate came from the Latin word communicare, which means is to convey, impart, or participate. Now, let's talk about the types of communication according to mode. To begin with, there are three modes of communication such as verbal, nonverbal, and visual communication. When we say verbal communication, it is all about the process of conveying a message that is either in the form of oral and written output. Some examples of oral communication are face-to-face conversation, speeches, hosting a radio, interviews, and more. On the other hand, a great examples of written communications are letters, texting, emails, books, and many more. Next, we have the non-verbal communication, where it is the process of communication using body language to convey a message. And a good example of this is by waving, which can be interpreted as expressing hello or goodbye. Also by doing a head nod, which can be interpreted as agreement to something in particular. Lastly, we have visual communication, where it is the process of graphically representing information wherein the audience interprets the visual object to understand the message that it wants to deliver. An ideal example of this are infographics, charts, and graphs. Now, let's move on to the types of communication according to context. First of all, we have intrapersonal communication. It came from the Latin prefix intra, which means within or inside. To make it short, it is the act of talking to yourself where the basis is our own feelings, biases, and beliefs. Second, we have interpersonal communication. It came from the Latin prefix inter, which means between, among, and together. To make it simple, it is just the communication between two or more people in an informal conversation. Third, we have extended communication. This communication is very familiar to everyone since it utilizes the electronic media to convey a message. With the help of advanced technologies, we can send our messages quickly in a single tap. Fourth, we have intercultural communication, where it is the exchange of information among individuals with diverse language, religious, ethnic, social, and professional backgrounds. Individuals with varying orientation communicate and perceive information in distinctive ways. Lastly, we have organizational communication, where it focuses on the role of communication, specifically the organizational context, wherein the organization puts a system of communication in order to work effectively across all employees of the company. Now, let us proceed to the types of organizational structure. To begin with, we have formal and informal communication, wherein formal communication enables interaction between roles in the organization via designated channels of message flow. Under the formal communication, there are four categories. First is the downward communication, where the communication flows from higher to lower positions. Second is the upward communication, where the communication flows from lower to higher position. Third is the horizontal communication, where the communication occurs at the same positions but from different departments to coordinate with each other. Fourth is the crosswise communication, where the communication flows from employee to employee that works at various levels but from different departments. On the other hand, informal communication takes place from unofficial channels. This happens due to the employees' dissatisfaction with their superiors. Lastly, let's talk about the types of communication according to purpose and style. There are two types of style and purpose of communication, which is the formal and informal style of communication. When we say formal, It observes formal use of language that can be delivered both oral and written. On the other hand, when we say informal, it certainly does not observe formal use of language. It includes personal beliefs that occur between casual conversations with friends, family members, and neighbors. I'm giving the floor now to Mr. Andre Solis to discuss the communication process.
Thank you, Mr. Alhambra, for the very wonderful information that you have given us. And now we move on to the communication process, which is composed of participants, messages, context, channels, interference, and feedback. First, the participants. Participants are the individuals who assume the roles of senders and receivers during an interaction. First, the sender. The sender transmits messages using verbal symbols, visual images, and nonverbal behavior. He is the one who starts the process of communication. To make the communication between sender and receiver a success, the sender must know how to communicate his ideas verbally and non-verbally. He must compose his ideas well. He must have the knowledge of correct grammar usage. And he should understand who the receiver is to make the message more relevant for him. And next is the receiver. The receiver is the person whom the message is transmitted to. He interprets the message that has been conveyed to them. He can be one person or even a group of people receiving the message. Next is the message. The message may be the most essential element of effective communication. Messages can be presented through verbal utterances, visual images, and nonverbal behaviors, to which meaning is attributed during communication. The message is what the receiver perceives it to be. It is the responsibility of the sender to compose the message properly to get the feedback he wants. He must thoroughly evaluate how the message can be interpreted. To understand how messages are created and received, we must know the following. First are the meanings. Meanings are the ways participants make sense of messages. Next is symbols, which are the words, sounds, and actions that represent specific ideas and feelings. Third is encoding. It is the process of putting your thoughts and feelings into words, nonverbal signs, and images. Next is decoding, which is the process of interpreting another's message. And lastly is form or structure. When the message is complex, we may need to reorganize it in sections or in a certain order to make it easier to understand. Last is context. Context involves expectations of the sender, the receiver, and the common or shared understanding through the environmental signals. It is the circumstances surrounding a message. The circumstances might include the setting, the value positions of the people, and the appropriateness of the message. This means considering the receiver, the place where you will be speaking, the era, and the accepted norms. Context will be divided into 5 subunits. First is physical context, which is the location, environmental conditions, and distances between the communicators and the time of day. Next would be social context. It is the nature of the relationship between the participants. The third one is historical context, which is the background provided by previous communication episodes between the participants that influence understandings in the current encounter. Next is psychological context. It is the moods or feelings of the participants during the communication encounter. Lastly, the cultural context, which are the values, attitudes, beliefs, orientations, and underlying assumptions prevalent among the people in a society. And the next part, which are the channels, interference, and feedback, are to be discussed by Mr. Kaka.
The channel refers to the means by which a message is transmitted. It can be face-to-face communication channel or technologically mediated communication channel. Face-to-face communication channel includes verbal symbols, non-verbal cues, and visual images. Technological mediated communication channel includes non-verbal cues such as movements, touch, and gestures represented by visual symbols like emoticons. Interference, commonly known as noise or barrier, refers to anything or event that impedes the process of communication, which may result in misunderstanding. There are three types of barriers. The first one is physical. This includes sights, sounds, and other stimuli in the environment. The next one is psychological. This includes internal distractions based on thoughts, feelings, or emotional reaction to symbols. Lastly, linguistic and cultural barriers pertain to the language and its cultural environment. Feedback refers to the answer or reaction of the receiver to the received message. It may be written, spoken, or acted out. Now that we have finished discussing the elements of communication process, let's call on Mr. Mercado and Mr. Totanes to discuss the different communication models.
I'm Allen Totanes and I am here to start off our discussion regarding the models of communication. So what exactly are these models used for? These models are used to represent the process of communication, and the three of the most well-known models are linear model, we have interactional model, and the transactional model. And these differ depending on the elements, the flow, and the structure of these models. So continuing, let us first discuss the linear models and some of its examples. So before we start, we must know that a linear communication model illustrates the process behind a one-way communication where the sender receives and no sort of feedback is received. Now, let's look at an example. Here we have me and my friend David Sintasas. So as a real-life scenario, let's say I want to tell him that I am a cool guy. So the process starts off with me as the information source, where my transmitter is my mouth. And the signals would then be in the form of vibrations or my voice, which is ready to be received by David's ear. However, in the process which the signals travel through a channel which is air, there is a large thunder which overflows David's sense of hearing. And so this may cause miscommunication or misunderstanding when once David interprets the message. Let's look at Shannon-Weaver model for example. This is a great illustration on how communication can be interrupted. We can see how it starts off with the information source sending out a message through a transmitter, and this message travels in the form of a signal. And then the signal passes through a channel which is prone to noise. So we can see how the message absorbed by the receiver can be different to what is intended by the source due to the influence of noises. So once done, the receiver is ready to absorb the signals, which will then be interpreted by its destination. So now, let's look at some brief explanations in case the model is hard to understand. So these are the factors in Shannon-Weaver's model. We have the information source, which denotes the start of the process. It is the component responsible for sending the message. And the message is anything conveyed which contains information. So the transmitter, it is an instrument used to send out the message, in which we will give a few examples later. And the signal contains the transmitted message in the form of symbols, gestures, sounds, and many more. So a few more examples are visuals. The channel, it is a medium where the signal can travel. And noise, anything that interferes with the process of communication. So there are different types of noises. It may be physical, physiological, psychological, and semantic. So we also have the receiver, which is an instrument used to receive the signal. And destination, it denotes the end of the process. It is the component which interprets the message. I hope my example really helped out in explaining the process of communication through Shannon-Weaver's model. So let's continue off with Aristotle's model of communication. And it is a process which revolves mainly on the speaker or the sender. So, looking at it, it starts off with the speaker, which sends out his prepared speech to his audience, which creates a certain effect. And this communication revolves around an occasion which suggests that this is a great illustration of communication in public speaking. Let me give out brief explanations in case the model is really hard to understand. So first, we have the speaker, which denotes the start of the process. It is the component which sends the message. Then we have the prepared speech, which contains the message of the source, and the audience, which it is the component which receives the speech, and the effect, which is the influence of the speaker's speech to the audience. And so we have the occasion, which creates the context behind the other elements. So what's the best example I can give which will help me explain Aristotle's model of communication? It would be this recording. And what's the occasion in our example? Since the occasion helps define the other elements, we must always know the occasion. And in our case, it would be an oral report. So the speaker would be defined as the reporter, and then my prepared speech would be defined as a lecture. And the audience or the listeners would be defined as learners, and its effect on the learners would be considered as knowledge. And so, if you're listening right now, can the audience reply to me? No, it's because this is a recorded video. And so, this makes it linear where I cannot receive feedback, but I can give out messages. I hope my example has really helped you understand the process of communication through Aristotle's model. And so, let's proceed to Berlow's model of communication. So, what exactly is Berlow's model of communication? It focuses on the factors behind the main elements of communication, and similar to the previous two models, it is also a linear model. And the main elements consists of the source, the message, the channel, and the receiver. We can see here on the model, the uppermost part, we have the source, which encodes information in the message, which will be passed on through a channel, and where it is ready to be decoded by the receiver. So we can see below each main elements, there are sub-elements in which we will discuss later on. So let us read the sub-elements. So for the source and receiver, they have communication skills, attitudes, knowledge, social system, and culture. While for the message, it consists of content, element, treatment, structure, and code. While the channel consists of the senses. We have hearing, seeing, touching, and smelling. So in order to help familiarize ourselves with Berlow's model, I have here some key concepts to help you. So number one, it starts with the source, which encodes the message. The encoded message requires a channel so that it can travel to the receiver, and the receiver decodes the message. The source and the receiver's communication skills, attitude, knowledge, and background affects how well the message is encoded and decoded. We can see here how the sub-elements are connected with their main element. So the meaning of the message may change based on its treatment, structure, code, and element. So the channel tells which senses are involved to properly send and receive the information. So here we have an example to help ourselves familiarize with the process of communication through the lens of Berlow's model. And here is the scenario. You have me trying to tell an old woman what to do with computer bugs. So, of course, since we were both born in different eras, it's only a stereotype, but let's assume that our knowledge when it comes to technology will, of course, differ. So, it is only normal for us who have lived through different generations. We have different culture, knowledge, we have lived through different social systems. So, of course, misunderstanding might occur. And so, that basically sums up the process of communication through Berlow's model.
Thank you for that. And may I present myself? I am Edgar G. Mercado, and I'm going to discuss the interactive model of communication and the transactional model of communication. So this two is part of the three communication models. So let's start. So the interactive model of communication, and don't mind my eyes because I'm seeing the presentation. The interactive model of communication is more concerned with the communication process, and it has the same elements as the communication process, namely the sender, encode, message, decode, receiver, and the feedback. So what sets this model apart from the communication process is it is cyclical, meaning the sender can become the receiver once they receive feedback. And moving on, getting into the discussion in social media is an example of this model. So posting a message, for instance, it is anywhere like Reddit, Quora, Facebook, Twitter, is halfway through this model, meaning you start with the sender, then the sender encodes his or her message and the message itself. Now, the only criticism for this model is receiving feedback is indirect and slow. So we never know when we will receive a response from our receivers. It could be a day, a week, a month, or a year, or we never get a response from them at all. So on to the next. Receiving feedback might be affected with presence of the field of experience. So as you can see from the presentation, and as I can see it from my presentation, this particular element envelops the exchange of messages. So what this means is that both the sender and the receiver should have at least the same understanding of a topic, so that a common understanding and a discussion could be sustained. So on to the next. So I'm going to discuss now the transactional model of communication. So this model is not that different from the former. The only exception here is that exchange happens simultaneously. So meaning if we don't speak, even if we don't speak or respond at all, because communication is not only for speaking, or bodily gestures could send a message, add voice to the communicator, as this model calls it. And I quote Paul Walswick, you cannot not communicate. And personally, because I'm talkative, I need to satisfy that. So kidding aside, additionally, this model is anchored with making relationships guided by cultural, social, and relational context. So these three contexts, we have to ask ourselves questions. So cultural, do we have the same traditions or culture to the one we're talking to? Social, unstated norms, is it too rude or is it too polite? And relational context, your interpersonal history with your communicator. So let me give you an example, a class discussion. So there's your field of experience, the subject you're discussing, maybe it's math, English, physics, I don't know. And next, sustained feedback system is when your professor praises you for your correct answer or just nod his or her head when he or she expects something more from your answer, and your student-teacher relationship because of the sustained discussion. So even though it is complex, critics take it as the most systematic rather model out of history. So with that, that ends my discussion. Thank you, and on to the next speaker.
Good day, everyone. My name is David Brian Santasas, and I'm here to discuss the general principles of effective communication. So, the following principles can serve or guide us to communicate with others effectively. All of these are considered to be golden rules when it comes to effective communication. The following are purpose, audience, situation, knowledge, and open-mindedness. These keywords will make it easier for us to remember these principles and will ensure effective communication. So to start off, purpose. These are different reasons as to why you are communicating, whether it is to inform, persuade, or entertain. It's very important that we always remember our purpose, as it enables us to stay on track and be clear of what we are trying to convey. For the second purpose, we have audience. The style of speaking that we want to utilize will depend on who we are talking to. There are many ways to adjust the way we communicate with one another. Factors such as age, educational background, profession, culture, and many more can greatly make interactions more effective. The third principle is situation. Similar to the second principle, assessing the environment at which you are communicating in determines what type of language works well. This is where we become sensitive to the topics that may be too triggering or offensive to some or several groups of people. Knowledge will be the next principle. Essentially, communicating is just sharing with one another. It's important that we remember that communicating is also reliant on the correctness of what we are trying to say. We need to be wary of fake news and unreliable information, as we want the information to receive and to be able to learn something from us. Open-mindedness. Nobody is perfect. We need to learn to accept constructive criticism from the audience, as they will make us better people or speakers and writers. Being open-minded can lead to new perspectives and greatly influence ourselves to communicate much more effectively. So that is all for the general principles of effective communication. May I hand it over to Mr. De Guzman to discuss oral communication.
So thank you for that very wonderful explanation of yours, Mr. Santasas. Now, let us move on with oral communication, wherein as defined by Prabhavati and Nagasubramani, oral communication is a type of communication between a sender and a receiver, having the purpose of conveying information using verbal and visual aids. Moreover, Palmero 2019 stated that oral communication has multiple elements that must be assessed in order to make communication effective. So what are those? Those are body language, style, eye contact, understanding the audience, politeness, and such, suggesting that oral communication is actually complex and it undergoes certain processes. Integrating the two definitions from the respective researches, which was mentioned earlier, we can define oral communication as the complex communication between a sender and a receiver, having a certain process to convey information with the usage of verbal and visual aids. So moving on, when can we say that oral communication is effective? And when or what is its limits? Okay, so let us start with its effectivity. So, oral communication is effective when instant communication is required. So, the concrete example of this is when you are having a conversation with your friend, wherein you are simply establishing a instant communication between you and your friend. Moving on, we also have establishing direct relationship, such as your relationship with your teacher. You do need oral communication, wherein it is very effective in this aspect. Also, whenever detailed explanation is asked, oral communication is very effective. So in what way? Because when you are using oral communication, you get the chance to explain details
in an orderly manner, because we all know that not all information could be expressed through words. We could then explain it through speech. So in comparison with written communication, oral communication is effective when you are expecting an immediate response. So we all know that written communication takes a lot of time for the receiver to give a feedback to the sender. However, with the means of oral communication, the feedback could be given within a short period of time, because we all know that we are talking to them verbally. And with that, they could immediately hear it and make a response out of it. Lastly, oral communication is very effective when you are communicating with an individual who cannot read or write. Of course, if an individual cannot read or write, such as those individuals who doesn't have the opportunity to study, of course, they could not undergo written communication. So with the means of oral communication, they could then communicate with others. So that is actually very effective for them. So, however, oral communication also has its limits. Okay, so what are these limits? So first of all, oral communication has a very obvious limit, which first of all is linguistic barrier. What are these? So this could be the noise, and we are talking about the physical noise in this part, wherein if your surrounding is actually noisy, then the message between the sender and the feedback given by the receiver would then be affected, because if there is a noise, then the message would not be transmitted or given properly. Furthermore, one of the limits of oral communication is different interpretations. So we all know that whenever we talk to others, we get to interpret things in very different manners or different approaches. And with that, once a certain message was interpreted by them in a different way, then the message could be altered then, which could actually arise through misunderstandings. Also, a limit of oral communication is lack of attention, wherein if attention would not be given properly, either to the sender or to the receiver, the message or the feedback would not be transmitted properly as well. In addition, lack of preparation is actually one of the limits of oral communications, because we all know that oral communication is a form of impromptu speech. The sender or the receiver only has a little bit of time for them to process the message or the feedback, and for them to make an immediate response out of it. Lastly, messages require proper execution, and whenever a message would not be properly executed, then it would be considered as a limit, because the interpretation or the mood of the message might change. Let us now proceed with the principles of effective oral communication. Okay, so for the first principle, we have the purpose of communication must be clear. Because if the purpose is not clear at all, then what would be the point or the substance of the communication itself? Okay, to cite you a concrete example, we have here, "Hey there, can we talk?" Okay, and the receiver responds by, "Sure, what is there to talk about?" And the sender responds by saying, "It is about my new business." So you can see here that the purpose is exactly cited or stated there, meaning that the communication is actually effective. Okay, so for the second principle of effective oral communication, we do have feedback must be specific and timely. Of course, when a feedback is not that specific, then misunderstandings may rise upon it, right? Okay, so the sender, saying or asking, "Hey there, how are you?" And the receiver makes a response out of it by saying, "I'm fine these days." Okay, and she rather added that business is good as usual. How about you? You could see that her response is actually very specific. So for the third principle of effective oral communication, we do have message to be conveyed must be complete. Because if a message is not complete, then the details would not be there, of course, then the thought would not be complete as well. So to cite you, a concrete example of it is the sender saying that the task given this week is so hard, right? And the receiver made a response by saying, I do agree. Even the given due is hard to be met. So you can see how the completeness of message affects the whole conversation itself, right? So for the fourth principle of effective oral communication, we do have that statements must be concise. Because if a statement is not concise, meaning that it is too lengthy, having unnecessary information, then the message to be delivered might actually be not understand at all since there are too many information given. So to cite you a concrete example of this, do you watch drag race shows? And the receiver responded by saying, yes, I do watch drag race shows frequently. So you can see that the question asked was answered in a very concise manner. And that is how you effectively communicate orally with others. Okay, so for the last principle of effective oral communication, we do have delivery of message must be performed naturally. So, of course, that is not delivered in a very natural manner. So you must avoid delivering message in such a way. So you should say it by this way. So, delivery of message must be performed naturally. So you need to say messages or make feedbacks as if you are simply talking to someone, not as if you are performing a speech in front of them, because of course that would be awkward for the both party, as well as the mood or the tone of the message would completely change. So that concludes our principles when it comes to effective oral communication. So thank you. Let us now call Miss Austin Anthony so that we could proceed with the written communication.
Good day everyone, I'm Austin C. Anthony and I'm here to discuss about written communication. So first let us define it. According to Prabhavati, it is the oldest known form of communication. Oftentimes it is considered to be a formal method of communicating that is written and documented from the sender to the receiver. Letters, memoranda, research papers, reports, brochures, contracts are just some of its many examples. Nowadays, electronic mails or emails, text messages, websites, and some social media platforms belong to this category. Now, let us proceed to its effectivity and limitations. Written communication is effective when communicating complex information. When this situation occurs, written communication is preferable. With having the message written, the reader can read it repeatedly until he or she gets to understand the entire message. Second, when there is a need for a permanent record. When one needs a permanent record, a written document is often made. It is preferable also for future reference, such as contracts. Third, when bulk communication is desired. Written communication makes it easy to send a message to many people, thus making a bulk communication, such as electronic mails or emails. When the audience is large in number and are all over the world, the sender can efficiently distribute the same written document. Fourth, when interaction with the audience is not needed. Written communication is suitable when interaction is deemed to be unnecessary, such as distributing memoranda. Lastly, when applying consistency. Written messages do not change from person to person. This applies consistency to your receivers, and the accuracy of the message conveyed the same across your receivers, such as research papers. Let us now proceed to the limits of written communication. First, literacy skills. Literacy skills is a major factor in written communication. When your receiver does not know how to read, your message becomes meaningless to that person. Second, lack of feedback. In writing, there is no immediate feedback for many reasons. It may be too difficult to comprehend or it may be too long. For whatever reason, there is a solution to it. Write your message as detailed and accurately as possible. Third, delayed communication. Because of the lack of immediate feedback, it delays the transfer of message between the sender and the receiver. Fourth, absence of modulation. Absence of modulation doesn't convey the message effectively. Fifth, establishment of indirect relationship. To establish a direct relationship, open discussion is important. But nowadays, instant messaging can make this possible. However, oral communication is still more effective in developing direct relationship. Lastly, leakage of confidential data. Written communication leaks secrecy as the message passes from one person to another. For instance, the Human Resource Department manages the employees' biodata, reports, resumes, or even their termination papers. Therefore, it is really important for them to imbibe data privacy as they handle confidential data. Let us proceed to the 7 C's of written communication. First, remember to be clear. One must use clear language in which it should be explicit and succinct. Also, being brief helps emphasize the significance of your message. It is also important that in writing, your message must be coherent, which means that your ideas must be connected in an orderly manner. One must also avoid using technical terms or jargons just like what is displayed. Instead, use concrete words. Second, be concise. We must stop running around the bush. This means that you should get straight to the point. Circling around the same idea will just confuse your receiver even more. It's important to be brief in a way that you'll still be able to completely state your message. This will also help your receiver to understand you even more. Third, be concrete. To be concrete is to be able to support your claims firmly with concrete and factual evidence, data, and figures. One thing to remember is to never plagiarize others' works or even tamper actual data with new data. These are unethical practices. We must form an original approach in basing our ideas from others' works. Concreteness also means to convey a firm message to avoid false assumptions. Fourth, be correct. Choosing the correct words and using proper language is ideal in having effective communication. It increases trustworthiness and the receiver will feel that he or she is taken seriously. Also, grammatical errors and misspellings must be avoided. Now, can you guess which celebrity made this typographical error? Clue: he is the 45th US president. So the answer is former President Donald Trump. Fifth, be complete. You must provide all relevant and necessary information so as not to confuse your receiver. In addition, complex messages will require additional and supporting information. To lessen its complexity, subdividing the subjects will help clarify the message. Sixth, be courteous. This is one of the important ways to have effective communication. Approach your receiver with courtesy by constructing and choosing your words in a respectful manner. Furthermore, addressing someone properly is important. For example, nowadays, he and she aren't the only pronouns, and sometimes these are deemed unacceptable or offensive to others. Gender pronouns are important, especially to the LGBTQ+ community. Lastly, be considerate. Connect with your receiver. It's important to consider that not all our receivers are of our same age or have the same level of education, interests, and knowledge as we have. The level of attentiveness of our receiver depends on this factor. To summarize, following these guidelines will help us have a successful and effective written communication. That's all. May I call on Mr. Patrick Aragon?
Thank you, Austin. Now, let me discuss the ethical considerations in communication. Have you ever wondered what is ethics? What about ethics of communication? Let's find out. Ethics is commonly defined as a set of moral principles, rules, standards, or guidelines. According to a module published by PUP Santa Rosa in 2021, ethics in communication guides an individual's behavior while upholding one's morals in communicating. This can be applied in oral and written communication as well as in mass-mediated communication like newspapers, radio, and television stations, and digital communication like email. Now we have defined ethical communication. Why is it important? Ethics in the communication and public speaking process plays a very important role. It ensures that any messages we are communicating are trustworthy, reliable, and polite. When words are ethical, it means that the receiver's emotions or actions are not negatively affected. Most of the time, we tend to neglect the significance of ethics in communication. This is one of the reasons why our world today is full of misleading information and fake news. Everybody wants to speak loudly, react impulsively, open their mouth widely without taking into account the words, whether it may or may not trigger misunderstanding, division, and conflict. Ethics tells us that communication is a process, and we should think deliberately first before we speak or write. Not only we should be careful of our actions, but also of our words. For instance, a group of students is preparing for a graded oral presentation. In order for them to deliver authentic and accurate information, they should brainstorm, schedule meetings, and conduct research first before the actual reporting. Preparation and careful planning can help them achieve an impeccable oral presentation, ensuring that they will be able to communicate and interact with their teacher and classmates efficiently and effectively. But how do we determine these ethics or principles of communication? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you the National Communication Association Credo of Ethical Communication. The National Communication Association or NCA compose a credo of ethical communication that may help people achieve effective communication. This credo contains a set of principles that values the integral role of ethical communication in fostering truthfulness, fairness, respect, personal integrity, and responsibility in one's words and resulting actions. Credo is a Latin word which means I believe or creed in English translation. It contains beliefs and principles that guide a person's actions as defined by Merriam-Webster. I summarize the 9 principles of this credo into 5 general points. First, truthfulness. To have effective communication, we must verify the message first before sharing it to others. We should always validate the information whether it would be useful or harmful. Ethical communication should be based on facts and real information. It does not tolerate deceitfulness or lying. Second, honesty. Never plagiarize. It is a form of theft and crime. Plagiarism is unethical since you are stealing someone's property. It defeats the purpose of ethical communication, leading to academic and personal loss of integrity. Third, freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to express their views and opinions freely without restriction or interference. Fourth, respect. Before we react or respond, we should understand and listen to what the other communicators are trying to say. Interrupting them is rude and it will only cause hatred. The person speaking may have a negative perception that you don't value his or her ideas and opinions. Communication is our way to understand and develop relationships with each other, not to ignore and degrade. Lastly, privacy and confidentiality. We should always respect privacy and confidentiality while sharing information, opinions, and feelings. Ask the consent of the person first before sharing his or her personal data for other purposes. It is obviously unethical to violate the right of a person to protect and to keep his or her privacy confidential. Basically, the core principle of the credo for ethical communication is honesty and truth. As communicators and public speakers, we should always consider these principles when we are conveying a message or delivering a speech. Upholding these guidelines could help prevent us from committing any mistakes, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. Moreover, it does not only benefit the way we communicate and speak, but also on how we make decisions responsibly, think critically, and build relationships or connections with other people. That's all for today's presentation. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something new from this video. If you have any questions and clarifications, let's discuss about it tomorrow in our synchronous session. We'll have exciting activities and games, so don't be absent. Keep safe, everyone. See you tomorrow.